right, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Whatever time it is, wherever you are, welcome once more to another video podcast of Political News Time. I am your hostess, Alex Mayers. Hopefully one of these days I will actually be able to adhere to the normal schedule of Political News Time, which is 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time and 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But my life has been a little off schedule lately, but I'm getting there. I hope everyone's having a good afternoon. I primarily wanted to pop on today very quickly for Political News Time because I wanted to discuss this resurgence of COVID-19 that is happening, because yes, it's a medical situation, it's a health situation, but it has rapidly become a political situation. And I wanted to explain to many of you why it's a political situation and why, if you don't use common sense and you don't look out for your own well-being, it's going to create a political disaster, especially when it comes to Blacks, African Americans. Let me explain why. Since the national pandemic, or actually the international pandemic of the coronavirus has taken place, at the same time, there has been an increase when it's come to the awareness of the Black Lives Matter political movement. Actually, at this point, the Black Lives Matter political movement is not something that I feel any African Americans should support, because its core beliefs have just been lost in the movement, considering all of the other issues that have nothing to do with being African American being attached to the movement. At this point, the Black Lives Matter movement does not have anything to do with who I am as an African American, as a woman, as just a regular American Black woman. And if you're a Black woman out there too, which is why this podcast, as I said in a previous podcast, is specifically for Black women, you really need to pay attention to what I'm saying. Now, if you are a Black male who's a staunch Democrat, perhaps Black Lives Matter still is for you. But if you are somebody who is supporting it, then I suppose you don't love your mother or your sister or your aunt or your grandmother. Just keeping it real. I'm just keeping it real. As this pandemic has intensified, the Black Lives Matter political movement has intensified. It has manifested, it has antagonized several protests. From my perspective, an effort to lure people out of their homes who are African American. And I think it's been an effort to lure people who are some of the most vulnerable people to the coronavirus to their deaths. I'm sure a lot of people might say to themselves, wow, Alex Mayers, you sure sound like a conspiracy theorist. Maybe I do, but I suppose the people who are saying that or thinking that in regards to what I'm saying today are people who are not familiar with something called the Tuskegee experiment. All right. Please, if you are an African American woman, stop going to these BLM protests as of current. Because if you don't, you are going to find yourself being blamed for the rise of this coronavirus epidemic. If you take a look at a tweet, and I'm going to post a link to this graph. I might even insert this particular graph into this podcast when I edit it later. It's from the New York Times. Just go to the NY Times Twitter account. As of June 26th of 2020, they posted the following tweet. All 50 states in the U.S. have begun to reopen in some way, even as the country is beginning to see a record number of cases per day. And they're referring to the coronavirus. All right. Whether this coronavirus is actually creating more deaths or not, We are starting to see more data on the deaths. Why? Well, it could be because there actually is an increase in cases, but it also could be due to there being more testing readily available.
Testing is a double-edged sword. We've tested now 25 million people. It's probably 20 million people more than anybody else. Germany's done a lot. South Korea's done a lot. They call me, they say, the job you're doing, here's the bad part. When you do testing to that extent, you're going to find more people, you're going to find more cases. So I said to my people, slow the testing down, please.
But as these numbers come in, it has the graphs that they're showing, again, from the New York Times, is starting to reflect that the highest number of cases seem to be in areas where there are the highest number of African Americans. And I think that all of this is by design. So stop attending these protests, because these protests are being put together by people who really don't seem to have in the best interest the well-being of African American women. Men, yes. Women, no. That is why I feel that now is a really good time for African American women to start opening their minds politically and being open to transitioning from being a Democrat to a Republican. Now I want to go back in time a little bit, and we're going to go back to the days of President Lyndon B. Johnson. Someone brought to my attention the other day, and I'm not going to say who or where this occurred, but someone brought to my attention that if it were not for Lyndon B. Johnson, today, quite a few African Americans who are currently Democrats would instead be Republicans. I'm going to start this time travel journey over on Snopes.com, because I do believe that everyone needs to investigate things for themselves. And what I'm about to disclose to many of you, which is posted on Snopes.com, the conclusion that they reached was that it was unproven, what I'm about to share. Here's the claim. The claim is that President Lyndon B. Johnson once said, quote, "I'll have those N-words voting Democratic for 200 years," end quote. All right. Now, Snopes was unable to prove or disprove that Lyndon B. Johnson actually said this. All right. And then Snopes goes into some quotes from Lyndon B. Johnson that are a bit more extensive. Quote, "These Negroes, they're getting pretty uppity these days, and that's a problem for us, since they've got something now they've never had before, the political pull to back up their uppityness. Now we've got to do something about this. We've got to give them a little something. Just enough to quiet them down, but not enough to make a difference." Quote, "I'll have those N-words voting Democratic for the next 200 years. I didn't know he ever said this. Okay? But again, this has been unproven. So I decided to do a little bit more research into this, because I consider myself a fairly educated woman. So I thought to myself, okay, who would most likely defend this in a way? And I thought, what's the current news outlet that is the most Democratic that there is? MSNBC. I, for many years, was a giant follower of MSNBC, but it started giving me heart palpitations So I had to give MSNBC a break for a while. So now I've transitioned over to Fox News. But when it comes to Lyndon Johnson, I thought to myself, let me turn to MSNBC. Say it ain't so, MSNBC. They couldn't. As of April 11th, 2014, here's an article from MSNBC that I will read to you in part. Lyndon Johnson was a civil rights hero, but also a racist. This was an article written by Adam Serwer. Editor's note: readers may find some language included to be offensive. Lyndon Johnson said the N-word a lot. In Senate cloakrooms and staff meetings, Johnson was practically a connoisseur of the word. According to Johnson biographer Robert Caro, Johnson would calibrate his pronunciations by region, using Nigra with some Southern legislators and Negra with others. Discussing civil rights legislation with men like Mississippi Democrat James Eastland, who committed most of his life to defending white supremacy, he'd simply call it the N-word bill. Then in 1957, Johnson would help get the N-word bill passed, known to most as the Civil Rights Act of 1957. With the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the segregationists would go to their graves knowing the cause they'd given their lives to had been betrayed, Frank Underwood style, by a man they believed once to be one of their own. When Caro asked segregationist Georgia Democrat Herman Talmadge how he felt when Johnson, signing the Civil Rights Act, said, "We shall overcome," Talmadge said, "Sick." The Civil Rights Act made it possible for Johnson to smash Jim Crow. The Voting Rights Act, which made the U.S. government accountable to its black citizens and a true democracy for the first time. Johnson lifted racist immigration restrictions designed to preserve a white majority, and by extension, white supremacy. He forced FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, then more concerned with communists and civil rights activists, to turn his attention to crushing the Ku Klux Klan. The Fair Housing Act never fulfilled its promise to end residential segregation. It was another part of a massive effort to give up the ideals America's founders only half-heartedly believed in, a record surpassed only by Abraham Lincoln. I'm going to stop right there, but I will post the link to this entire article over on Political News Time, probably later this evening when I have a time to edit this and repost this. But this is very important to hear, because basically what was going on at that time was that even though Lyndon Johnson was a racist, he was looking to put a stop to segregation. All right? But look at what's happening today with this BLM, Black Lives Matter movement. What's happening today is that you have this guy, Hank Newsom, who was just showcased on the mainstream media, who claims to be one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, openly pushing the concept of segregation by saying that he wants sovereignty. He wants to separate himself from white America by saying, hey, we don't want whites here, meaning in his community. That basically enables white supremacist groups to come forth now and say, hey, okay, well, if you're going to be down with Hank Newsom, you need to be down with us too. David Duke, he might already be, getting his little team going on this. So black women especially, but also black men with open minds, you need to think, especially right now, about not just your future, but the future of your children. You need to say to yourself, okay, we need to move more toward a future to where the only race that's acknowledged is the human race, not a bunch of little pockets based on skin color. Just saying. Just saying. But I want to continue by bouncing over to the Atlantic now, okay? And I will post a link to this article as well. It's titled, When Black Voters Exited Left, What African Americans Lost by Aligning with the Democratic Party. This was written by Matthew Delmont, March 31st of 2016. Days before the 1960 election, Coretta Scott King received a phone call from then-candidate John F. Kennedy while her husband was in a Georgia jail, charged with trespassing after leading a sit-in demonstration against segregation in Atlanta. Let me pause there real quick. Again, back in the 1960s, you had leaders like Martin Luther King against segregation. Okay, but today we have supposed African American male leaders like this Hawk Newsom, who does not speak for me, and I'm sure doesn't speak for a lot of you out there also who are African Americans, pushing segregation. Anyone else see something wrong with this? I can't possibly be the only one who thinks that this is the twilight zone that we're living in. Let me continue. Quote, "This must be pretty hard on you. And I want to let you both know that I'm thinking about you and will do all I can to help," end quote, Kennedy told her. The Democratic nominee's brother and campaign manager, Robert Kennedy, called a DeKalb County judge and successfully lobbied for Martin Luther King Jr.'s release. The personal call and the timely intervention significantly bolstered Kennedy's standing among Black voters. They also strengthened the political alliance between the Democratic Party and African Americans. After his release, King praised Kennedy for exhibiting, quote, moral courage of a higher order, end quote. His father and influential Baptist pastor, Martin Luther King Sr., said, quote, "Kennedy can be my president, Catholic or whatever he is. I've got all my votes and I've got a suitcase and I'm going to take them up there and dump them in his lap," end quote. Kennedy earned 68% of the Black vote, which was the decisive factor in key states like Illinois, Michigan, and South Carolina. Once in the White House, Kennedy faced pressure from civil rights activists to make good on what King called, quote, "a huge promissory note," end quote, to pass meaningful civil rights legislation. When President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, he cemented a political alliance between African Americans and the Democratic Party that continues to this day. But celebrating these landmark pieces of legislation makes it easy to overlook what Black people in the United States lost when civil rights and equality for Blacks were hitched to the Democratic Party. While the passage of the Civil Rights Act helped Lyndon Johnson earn support from 94% of Black votes in 1964, there is a gulf between what Black Americans hoped the legislation would achieve and what Democratic politicians actually delivered. Although the Civil Rights Act of 1964 helped end apartheid conditions in the South, a critical objective for which grassroots Black Southern activists fought and died, the legislation did little to address the structures of racism that shaped Black lives in cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia. This was an intentional consequence of how the bill sponsors largely liberals from the North, Midwest, and West crafted the legislation. I'm going to stop right there. If you want to read this entire thing for yourself, I will post this link as well. But what was going on then and what this article outlines when it comes to the structures of racism that shaped Black lives in predominantly liberal areas does reflect what's going on today with the Black Lives Matter movement. As I said earlier, I do not support the Black Lives Matter movement because so many liberal agendas have been tacked onto it that have nothing to do with me, that I feel like, why am I going to allow myself to be the face of issues that I may not support? I'm not doing it. You don't get to use me like that. You don't get to view me as by default being with you. When, at least throughout my lifetime, when it's come to so-called liberal America, they haven't helped me one bit. If anything, they've harmed me. Who controls liberal United States adult entertainment industry? Look at that. The adult entertainment industry in America, which is something that's a part of my history, is controlled by liberals. That did nothing but harm so many areas of my life that it's ridiculous. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and end this particular podcast with that. But again, when it comes to this COVID-19 resurgence, don't let yourself be a scapegoat for this Black America by being lured out into danger zones where people are not wearing masks, are not practicing social distancing, and are spreading this disease. And just don't put it past people to be possibly spraying down some of these protests with this virus. Again, look up that Tuskegee experiment. And I'm not saying that it's forces from within the United States doing this, but there's a lot of forces outside of the United States that have political agendas within the United States. And don't for a second think that these foreign forces are not here and active within the United States, quietly pulling strings. Because I believe that they are. And if that makes me a conspiracy theorist, too damn bad. I'm actually a realist. So thanks everyone for taking the time to visit with me today. Hopefully I will be here again tonight, 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and we'll talk about something else. Later today, I actually need to post a notice in regards to the adult entertainment industry when it comes to a very well-written update from the Free Speech Coalition PASS, who I think is trying to make some changes for the better, but who a foreign entity seems to have an interest of attempting to oppress and dominate. So I'll be doing my thing when it comes to that later today. Anyways, have a great day. See y'all later. Take care. Touch.